Today I am in northwestern Georgia. I'm actually visiting friends that live here not all that far from the battlefield at Chickamauga in northwestern Georgia, the Civil War battle. I am standing outside of the visitor center of Chickamauga battlefield, as you can see behind me here. This was the first national military park in the United States. It was officially dedicated in 1895. This park was actually created through the efforts of the very men who fought here. Actually, as you walk through this park, you'll see a bunch of cast iron signs, which we'll be seeing here in a minute. And these cast iron signs or markers have information on them. These markers were created by the veterans of this battle and written by them, and you can tell quite clearly because they're all written in various military lingo. It's very hard for some people to understand if you weren't already in the military or serving here at the time. But they put the effort into correctly mark these locations with these signs and put up these markers so future generations would remember what they did here and what they lost here. The Battle of Chickamauga is unique as it was a decisive victory for the Confederates, but yet deadly to the Southern cause. It was also unique as being the second worst battle in the entire Civil War, second only to the Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, Gettysburg and Chickamauga actually share similarities. They were both deadly battles. They both were victorious for the defending army. And some Confederate men that actually fought at the Battle of Gettysburg also fought at the Battle of Chickamauga, despite that these battles were in two different theaters of war, over 500 miles away from each other, and only 2.5 months apart. Being Chickamauga was fought in September 19th and 20th of 1863, and Gettysburg was the 1st, 2nd, 3rd of July of 1863. So join me as I walk through the park and explore the highlights of the Gettysburg of the South, the Battle of Chickamauga. So the Battle of Chickamauga was actually fought between two armies, one of the Union Army, which was General Rosecran's Army of the Cumberland, and the Confederate Army, General Bragg's Army of Tennessee. Now, in the situation that was here, Rosecrans, who was the Union general in charge of the Army of the Cumberland, he actually had superior numbers. He successfully outmaneuvered Bragg on multiple occasions, and actually almost on all occasions. With brilliant strategic moves, Rosecrans was able to take Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is just north of this location, with very little fighting. And successfully pushed Bragg south down into Georgia, which is where we're at now, and the northwestern corner of Georgia at Chickamauga. In order to combat this attacking army of the Cumberland under General Rosecrans, General Bragg received reinforcements from the Confederates' forces in order to match Rosecrans' larger Union army. The Confederates in charge of these movements actually brought in Lieutenant General James Longstreet and his 12,000 men, which were shipped by rail from Virginia. And that was after they suffered a defeat in Gettysburg 2.5 months beforehand. They had to ship them 925 miles by rail, by train. They actually had to go around Knoxville because Knoxville was already captured by the Union. So in order to get them there, he had to take the long way around, bring them in Atlanta, and then actually bring them up to Chattanooga. By the time you had Longstreet's men here, the reinforcements and other reinforcements that brought in to assist Bragg, there was an estimated of 68,000 Confederate soldiers in Bragg's Army of Tennessee ready to combat Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland. So the majority of the battle here at Chickamauga actually started on September the 19th of 1863. That was day one of the battle. Fierce fighting was seen along the Chickamauga Creek as charge and counter-charge between the Union and Confederate lines, and the thick forest went back and forth through smoke-filled forests and thick wooded areas. As you can see behind me here, actually this is probably relatively clear in comparison to what actually was here because they probably had a fair amount of underbrush. They were fighting so close to each other that the lines of these people, of these two sides, the Confederates and the Union, actually got extremely close. And you'll actually see over here, and I was telling you about those various markers, the cast iron markers. Anything that's blue like this is Union markers, and then anything that is like a red or a gray or whatever, that's the Confederate markers. But to illustrate how close these lines were and how close the fighting was, here is a good example of these Union lines. But then over here, just within a few feet, is a marker for the Confederate lines. So they were extremely close to each other. Because of all this fighting, you had smoke filling the area with cannon fire and gunfire and rifle fire, and you couldn't see what was going on. It was a confusing, chaotic mess. Nobody knew where the lines were and who was where and what and everything. It was very confusing. And because of that, Chickamauga actually earned its name here at this battle, and Chickamauga means river of blood. Now, Bragg tried to force the Union Army south. The general consensus of what General Bragg was trying to do was he was actually trying to move the Confederate line into the Union line with the idea of pushing the left flank west and then south and cutting the Union Army off from their stronghold at Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is in the north. So as he was trying to push them west and then south, pushing his right side, Bragg's right side, but the Union left, and trying to push them south, it put pressure on the Union, but all it did was actually force them west. So from this position here, this would be the left flank of the Union Army, and they would have been pushing them towards the Lafayette Road, which is just to the west here. And that was basically what they did on day one, pushed them to the west of Lafayette Road, and at the end of the day, the fighting slowed down, and the Union dug in on the west side of Lafayette Road, which is just over in that direction right over there. Just on the first day alone, 15,000 casualties were created here at the battle, and that was for both sides. As the Union and the Confederate soldiers camped, the wounded was still out in the forest. They didn't gather them all up. They couldn't. It was getting dark, and of course everything was hiding in the brush and the trees and the smoke. You couldn't see them, but you could hear the cries and the screams for help. But then you had, it's very dry down here, especially in September, so they actually, even today in modern times, they don't have a lot of, they have laws that prevent you from burning things, so you prevent forest fires. Well, they had to have camps because it was very cold out. Well, when the campfires got away from them, it would create forest fires and would burn the forest. And you have these cries of screaming men being burned to death as they were laying there wounded and didn't have any help. There was actually an Indiana sergeant named Thomas McGee who served in the Union, and he described these cries. He says, "It was the storm of groans and cries for help that come on the black night air. To this day, that dying, wailing petition is still ringing in our ears." So Bragg's plan was to have James Longstreet for the next day move his men and onto the southern end of the Confederate line, which would be the right in front of the right center of the Union line. The idea was to attack at dawn, starting in the north, hitting the left flank of the Union Army and hitting them hard right here at this location, and starting to pinwheel the line around to the south and pushed the Union south and cutting them off from their supplies at Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was actually a very brilliant plan, but unfortunately it did not work out for them, as you will see. Despite Bragg's plan to attack at dawn, the Confederates actually did not initiate the attack until 9:30 in the morning, and it would have been the Confederate right moved towards the Union left, and they pushed extremely hard against them right here. Now, this position on the Union line was commanded by Major General George H. Thomas, and he was being hit extremely hard here. He was getting hit hard, and he was afraid he was going to lose the left flank, and then they anticipated what Bragg and the Confederates were going to do was push them to the south, and they didn't want to do that. So Thomas was sending correspondence and couriers and notes and things requesting reinforcements to support the left flank of the Union line, and he was sending them to Rosecran's headquarters. Rosecran was the general in charge of the Army of the Cumberland here, in charge of the Union forces. And anytime that he would send a plea, most of the time Rosecrans would respond with more reinforcements, moving men up the line from the right and the center and moving them to the left flank. And it got to the point where Thomas was requesting so many reinforcements to back up his left flank that 1/3 of the army, the Union Army, actually was on the left flank here on the battlefield, leaving part of the areas exposed to the south. So here I'm standing along what's called the Brotherton Road. It's in the battlefield at Chickamauga here. And right here is actually where the Confederate line on the southern part of their line, or on their left center essentially, stood. And this is where Longstreet's men, who freshly 2.5 months previously were actually up in Gettysburg, and they stood here 5 lines deep. And they were in this wooded area right here, and again, this whole area would have been relatively foggy because of smoke and various things, and also because of the weather in September. But they would have set in this line, or in this woods right here. Now, if you look across the Lafayette Road, which would be right here behind me, where these cars are going, that is what is called the Lafayette Road. Now, on the other side of the Lafayette Road was where the Union Army was dug into, and they were sitting over there. Well, they didn't realize how many soldiers were sitting over here in Longstreet's division because of the tree cover. But the Union had a line over here. Now, the problem was there was a large amount of chaos. Everybody was confused on what was going on, and they were moving a lot of reinforcements up to the north of here on the left flank. This would be the Union Army, Rosecrans. He was moving a lot of soldiers to the left flank north of here, and by doing so, he thought that he created a hole in his center line, which is about a 1/4 mile north up the Union line from this position. But actually, he didn't create a hole. He thought he did. But in order to fill this imaginary hole, he contacted Brigadier General Thomas J. Woods. Now, Thomas J. Woods and his little division actually sat over here at the Brotherton House, which is across the Lafayette Road, which we'll go see here in a minute. This Woods was told by Rosecrans to move his division a 1/4 mile north to fill in this hole that he thought he created in his center line. Unfortunately, the hole that he thought he created didn't exist, and he created a hole in the line right here at the Brotherton House where Woods was, and he moved north out of the position, and he created a hole in the Union line. And it just so happens that Longstreet, who had his 5 lines of men located here in this woods, decided to march straight through that hole. They didn't even know there was a hole there, but they marched straight through it, and that was the costly mistake that cost the Union the Battle of Chickamauga. So behind me is the Brotherton House. This is actually the hole where Woods was. So again, they've moved Woods north a 1/4 mile up the line in order to fill in an imaginary hole that didn't actually exist. And by doing so, he created a hole here. So all was left here was a few skirmishers for the Union Army. But in that woods right behind here is actually 11,000 men under Longstreet's command. And they come busting out of the woods and met very little resistance here. General Bushrod Johnson's division under Longstreet actually marched to the Brotherton House, and right here at this area, and through the woods, breaking the right center of the Union line, at least what was left of it, and they took off across the field on the opposite side here, behind me right here, and they skedaddled the Union soldiers and pushed them basically from the battlefield.
Do you walk in the path of a soldier?
Yeah.
So behind me is where I just walked out of. This is the woods behind the Brotherton House that the 11,000 Confederates of General Longstreet's division came through, or General Longstreet's group of men. And then Bushrod Johnson's division was come crashing through these woods right here. And if we turn around here, they were actually in sight, and you might be able to see it here. But on the other side, on the very wood, there's a monument. Hopefully you can see it. We're going to go there eventually here, but that is Rosecran's headquarters. He is the commanding general of the Union forces in this entire battle. And the Confederates, Bushrod Johnson's division, Longstreet's group, comes out of this wooded area, and they're within sight of a headquarters where there's 1,000 men running around shuffling information. And they're going to take the headquarters. They're this close to it. Now, in front of the headquarters was the supply wagons. They would have set somewhere in this field right here. Okay, you needed wagons and caissons and ambulances and etc., all this stuff to carry supplies and things like that in order to support the battle that is supposed to be occurring over here. But actually a quarter mile that way. But it turns out that the battle now has come the whole way over here, and because of this hole in the line, and the Confederates are advancing quickly onto the Union, the stuff that's actually supposed to be protected behind the lines. Now, there's an interesting story that occurs here, and it's about Madame Nadine Turchin. Okay, she was a Russian wife, actually they were both Russians, of a Union commander named John Turchin. John Turchin was serving on the line at the current time, and Madame Turchin, his wife, was staying with the wagons. So women were not necessarily supposed to be involved in combat situations, but she was a very headstrong socialite Russian. She comes from a high stature in her family, and she was actually so against the English language, she refused to speak it, saying that it was beneath her. And a lot of these people were beneath her, and she would put herself up on a pedestal. But the quartermasters in charge of these wagons, as they were seeing the Confederates crash through these woods and coming very close to the wagons, the caissons, and of course Rosecrans' headquarters, he panicked and he decided to just leave all the wagons and run. But Madame Turchin, she had other plans. She wanted to support her husband, who was in the fields, and she wanted to support his soldiers that needed this supplies and needed these ambulances and needed these wagons and needed this stuff. And so she decided to pull a large pistol on the quartermaster and pointed it straight at his head. And in perfect English, breaking her own rule of not talking or not speaking English, basically told the fella that he's going to take the wagons with him or she's going to shoot him in the head. So Madame Turchin convinced the quartermaster, under duress of course, to save the wagons and the supplies. And it was a surprise to General Turchin later that night when he was astonished to see that his wife was leading the supply wagons safely back to camp. Now again, as we're going to head this way, but these Confederate lines were coming across. They were coming to where the quartermaster had his wagons, and they could see Rosecrans' headquarters in the distance, and that was where they were heading next. So behind me here is the pyramid for the field headquarters of the Army of the Cumberland. This was where General Rosecrans had his headquarters on the second day. And as I said before, the Confederates were advancing to this headquarters. Actually, in the background here, they would have came out of them woods over here and across this field. And then that's where they would have met the wagons and the couriers and the ambulances and all that was sitting over here. And they were moving and trying to get down these roads so they can escape. And then they assaulted this headquarters. Now at the headquarters here, there was 1,000 men that surrounded this area. They were couriers, and they were recording men and clerks and generals and all these people that were used for basically the logistics of this entire battle. So they were moving information, letters, orders from Rosecrans as he was observing the battle and how it was going. He was getting information funneled to this headquarters, and then he was having information leave. It was the center of the shuffle of information of the entire battle. The head of the snake of the Union Army here, literally. And the head of the snake was going to be cut off because there was 11,000 Confederate soldiers advancing on this position. As the soldiers, the Confederates, were marching towards this position, Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana was present here. He was actually sent here to observe and report on the movements of Rosecrans and Bragg's armies and report it back to Washington. He was tired, and he actually slept on the ground as the battle was commencing in the morning here. He was awakened by what he referred to as the most infernal noise I ever heard. The battle had reached the headquarters as the Confederates charged out of the woods and battled soldiers in a nearby field. Dana said that he saw General Rosecrans, who was a Catholic, cross himself. Okay? And he made a comment and said, if the general is crossing himself, we are in a desperate situation. Balls and shells rained down on the headquarters here, causing Rosecrans to order everyone to flee for their lives. So everybody had to escape further west and get out of this area, away from the headquarters itself. Rosecrans himself had to ride south, which would have been that way. And he had to go to his right flank, which was commanded by Sheridan, and order them to attack the advancing Confederates. So with a small group of men of basically his war council, essentially, he headed south to meet Sheridan to give them orders, because his couriers no longer worked anymore. They all had to skedaddle from their location, so he had to give the orders himself. So while the left flank of the Union line was battling a fierce battle with almost 1/3 of the Union army to the north of this position, and the right center of the Union line broke under attack under James Longstreet because of the hole created by Rosecrans, and then the right flank at the time was under the command of Sheridan. Okay, now Sheridan had 2 brigades that were being led by a general, actually a brigadier general, William Haynes Lytle. Now Lytle, commanding 2 brigades of Sheridan's men here on the right flank, he was actually a poet before the war, and his most famous poem was called Antony and Cleopatra. Now, Lytle's lines were falling apart. He had Confederates breaking the line to the north of him. They were pushing him back here. And he actually sat on his horse with sword drawn in hand, and he said, "All right, men, we can die but once. This is the time and place." 3 balls hit him at once. Hit him in the face and the body. The fatal shot actually entered his mouth, breaking teeth and exiting through the back of his neck. He was carried by several of his soldiers up a hill, which is now called Lytle Hill, and actually this is where we're standing here today, on top of Lytle Hill. And he was carried up here to this spot where this pyramid of cannonballs are. And actually, while he was being carried, one of his bearers was shot and killed in the process. They brought him up here, and he actually still alive at the time. And he nodded yes when they asked him if he wanted put down. So they put him down right here on this spot. And they stayed with him as long as they could, but the Confederates advanced so quickly that the bearers, the soldiers, actually had to leave him. And poor William Lytle actually died alone here on this hill. Colonel Silas B. Miller assumed command after Lytle perished, and he assumed command of Lytle's brigade. Unlike his dead commander, though, Miller was not a poet, and with a lack of sophistication, he actually wrote after the battle where he said that we entered the battle with no more chance than a broken-back cat in hell without claws. Patton Anderson, he was a Confederate general who commanded a brigade of Confederates that actually assaulted Lytle's position and attacked Lytle's men. Now, Patton Anderson was actually a good friend of Lytle before the war. And 3 years previously, they were together, and they actually promised that the war would not interfere with their friendship. Upon seeing Lytle's body, Anderson dismounted from his horse in tears and he kneeled down next to the body, and he mourned his friend. He took a ring from his finger and a lock of hair from Lytle's body, and he sent it to Lytle's family. And then that night he had a guard of Confederate soldiers posted around the body to protect it until they could return it to the Union lines, which eventually did happen under a flag of truce. That night after the battle here on September the 20th, 1863, around campfires of both sides, the men honored the man that died here, Lytle, by reciting his most famous poem, Antony and Cleopatra.
I am dying, Egypt, dying. Hark the insulting foeman's cry. They are coming. Quick, my falcon. Let me front them ere I die. Ah, no more bid the battle. Shall my heart exulting swell? Isis and Osiris guard thee. Cleopatra, Rome, farewell.